In the vast and silent wilderness of Montana, a man named Elias Grant lived alone, surrounded by pine-covered ridges and rivers that roared through canyons so deep they seemed to swallow sound and time alike. His cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, weathered by years of wind and snow, its roof patched with rough boards and its walls scarred like the man who built it. Once he had been part of the bustling world below the mountains, but the loss of his wife and child had driven him into the high country where no one could reach him or remind him of what he had lost. Now he was known to the townsfolk only as the Mountain Man, a shadow of mystery and warning. Whispers traveled down the trails and through the saloons, tales of how Elias had tried to find a wife through mail order, brides, desperate women from faraway places who sought a home in the untamed West. Each one had arrived full of hope, carrying a single trunk and dreams of a new life. But none lasted more than a week. Some fled before the first snow fell. Others left before the fire burned low on their seventh night. The reasons varied, but the result was always the same. They left behind silence and an empty chair at the table. The people in town said the Mountain Man was cursed that no woman could live in such loneliness that the forest itself rejected outsiders. They said his temper was as fierce as the storms that swept through the peaks, and that his eyes carried the look of a man haunted by ghosts. Others believed he wanted to drive the women away because he could not bear to care for anyone again. Whatever the truth was, no one dared to visit him anymore. Elias spent his days cutting wood, hunting for food, and tending to the few animals that still trusted him. The mountains were his only companions, and he preferred it that way. He moved through the forest with the ease of a creature born to it, his steps quiet, his breath steady. Every sound had meaning, every shadow, a story. He had built walls, not only around his cabin, but around his heart, and those walls were thicker than the winter ice that froze the river each year. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, it carried voices from the valley, faint laughter from the town below, or the ringing of a church bell. He would pause in his work and listen for a moment before turning away, as if the sound were a temptation he must resist. He did not need people. He told himself he had the mountain, the forest, the endless sky above. He had everything he needed, yet on long winter nights when the fire burned low and the silence pressed heavy against his chest, he would stare into the flames and feel the ache of something he refused to name. The story of Elias Grant was one of both. Fear and fascination to the townspeople, they spoke of him as though he were part of the mountain itself, immovable and wild. But even the strongest rock wears down over time. Even the coldest river finds warmth when it meets the sun. Elias did not know it yet, but fate had already set its course. A letter had been sent and a woman was on her way. A woman unlike any who had come before. She was not looking for riches or charm. She was looking for belonging. And though the path ahead would test them both, the mountain was about to witness a change that would echo through every silent pine and every storm that rolled across the peaks. Clara Whitmore stepped off the stagecoach with her boots sinking into the mud of the small Montana town. Her heart beating like a drum inside her chest. The air was thinner than she expected, and colder too, but it smelled of pine and promise. She adjusted her hat, smoothed her skirt, and looked toward the jagged mountains in the distance where her new husband waited, or so she hoped. The townsfolk had watched her arrival with a mix of pity and curiosity. They had seen many mail-order brides before, each one bound for the Mountain Man, and each one returning within a week, their faces pale and their voices trembling as if they had seen the devil himself. Clara was not like the others. She knew what it meant to be judged. She had grown up in a city where people looked at her size. Before they looked at her smile, she had heard the whispers and endured the laughter. She had learned to carry her weight with grace and humor. Though sometimes when she was alone, she wished she could shed not her body, but the expectations others placed upon it. She had agreed to marry Elias Grant, not out of foolish hope, but because she wanted a place where she could be useful, where she could build something with her own hands and not live as a shadow in someone else's world. The journey to his cabin was long and steep, the path narrow and lined. With snow, the guide who led her halfway turned back before sunset. Refusing to go farther, he said the man up there did not welcome visitors. Clara thanked him and continued alone, pulling her small cart and humming softly to keep her courage. She reached the cabin as night fell. The door creaked open before she could knock, and there he stood tall, broad and silent, his beard thick and his eyes the color of storm clouds. He looked at her as if she were a ghost. He did not believe in, "You should." "Go back," he said, his voice deep and cold. "This is no place for you." Clara met his stare and shook her head, her cheeks flushed from the cold and from something fiercer. "I came a long way, Mr. Grant," she said, "and I intend to stay for at least a week." He frowned but stepped aside, perhaps out of surprise, perhaps because he saw the fire in her eyes. The cabin was rough inside, with little more than a table, a stove, and a single chair. She unpacked her things quietly, aware of his watchful gaze. He spoke little that night, and she did not press him. Instead, she made a small meal from what she had brought and offered him a share he refused, but she left a portion for him anyway before sitting by the fire with her mending. As the days passed, Clara began to see through his silence. He rose before dawn to chop wood, his movements strong and measured. He mended tools and hunted game. He lived with discipline but without warmth, and she wondered if he even remembered what it felt like to laugh. When she burned their first breakfast, he scowled but said nothing, and when she slipped on the icy path, he caught her before she fell, though he quickly let go as if her touch had burned him. Still she stayed. She cleaned the cabin, swept the dust from corners that had not seen care in years, and filled the air with the scent of bread she baked in the old iron stove. She talked to him, even when he did not answer, told him stories from her childhood songs her mother used to hum, little by little. The cabin felt less like a prison and more like a home. Though Elias still carried a wall around him, Clara sensed the cracks forming each time their eyes met. Each time silence stretched not with anger, but with something unspoken and new. By the end of the first week, the man who had sent every bride away before the seventh sunset found himself watching her instead of the clock, and though he said nothing, his heart already knew she would not be leaving. The morning sun crept through the cracks in the shutters, spilling gold across the wooden floor. Clara woke early, her hands stiff from the cold, and her heart filled with quiet determination. She had been in the cabin for more than a week, and though Elias had not asked her to stay, he had also not told her to leave, that small mercy felt like victory. Each day had its share of struggle, but also of strange, gentle peace. She had learned how to split kindling without bruising her fingers, and how to move through the forest without losing her footing. She had learned the rhythm of the mountain and the rhythm of the man who lived upon it. Elias watched her with the same wary eyes he used when tracking a bear. He did not understand her. She smiled too often, spoke too softly, and worked too hard for someone who should have been afraid. Yet she seemed at home among the silence. Sometimes she hummed while washing clothes in the stream, her voice drifting through the pines like something alive. He found himself pausing to listen, though he would never admit it. She reminded him of warmth he thought he had buried forever. Their days were filled with quiet labor, and their nights with uneasy stillness. Sometimes the air between them felt as sharp as broken glass. Other times it carried the soft weight of something almost tender. One evening, Clara sat by the fire, darning a sock when Elias returned from the woods, his coat dusted with snow. She offered him a bowl of stew, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove. He hesitated, then took it, and for the first time since she arrived, he said, "Thank you." His voice rough and unsure, like a man learning a forgotten word. She smiled at him, then went back to her stitching, and the moment settled between them like a fragile truce. As the days grew shorter, winter began its slow descent upon the mountain. The air turned heavy with the promise of snow, and the world seemed to draw inward. The silence deepened until even their breaths felt loud one night. A storm came without warning. The wind howled against the roof, and the walls groaned as if the mountain itself were alive. The fire struggled to stay lit, and the cold slipped through every crack. Clara shivered despite. The blanket around her shoulders, Elias wordlessly added more logs to the fire. His movements quick and deliberate when she reached out to steady a falling pot. Their hands brushed, and time seemed to stop. The storm raged for 2 days, cutting them. Off from everything beyond the cabin, Clara sang to fill the silence, and Elias listened from his chair near the door, his eyes closed but not asleep. He told her of the wife he once had, a gentle woman named Anna, who had died in childbirth. His voice trembled, but he did not hide it. She told him of her own loneliness, the empty rooms she had cleaned for other people, the stares she had endured from men who saw her body before they saw her worth in that small cabin surrounded by wind and snow. 2 broken hearts found a rhythm that did not need words. When the storm finally ended, the world outside lay buried in white, the air crisp and still. Clara stepped out first, her breath rising in soft clouds. She looked at the endless snow and laughed. The sound bright and alive, Elias followed her outside, watching the way the sunlight touched her face, and in that moment, something inside him shifted. It was not loud or sudden, but steady like thawing ice. He realized he did not want her to leave, not because he needed help, not because he pitied her, but because she made the silence bearable. She made the mountain feel like home again. That night, he built the fire high, and she baked bread in the pan. He had fixed for her. They ate in companionable, quiet. And when she met his eyes, he did not look away. The walls around his heart had not fallen, but the first stones had begun to crack, and neither of them knew it yet. But love had already found its way through the cold. The days after the storm brought a fragile peace. The air held a calm that felt almost sacred. Clara had settled into life on the mountain, as if she had always belonged there. She tended the fire-mended clothes and learned to cook with the herbs that grew wild along the frozen paths. Elias no longer avoided her presence. He spoke little still, but his silence had softened his eyes, followed her without the sharpness they once held. There was a quiet understanding between them, a rhythm that no longer needed words. Sometimes he would bring her wildflowers found beneath the melting snow, and she would place them in a tin cup by the window, saying nothing but smiling in a way that made his chest ache. Yet peace in the mountains was never meant to last one afternoon. As Elias returned from hunting, he noticed tracks that did not belong to deer or bear. They were human, wide-set and heavy. He followed them for a while before stopping near the stream where the footprints vanished into the trees. He felt a chill, not from the cold, but from memory. He knew who it might be. A man from his past named Wade Turner, once a friend, now a bitter enemy. Wade blamed Elias for the death of his brother, a death born of greed and betrayal. Years ago, Elias had left that life behind, but the past had found its way up the mountain. When he returned to the cabin, Clara saw the tension in his shoulders and the shadow in his eyes. He told her nothing of what he feared, only that she should stay close to the house and keep. The rifle loaded, she wanted to ask, but she knew better. He was not a man who spoke of his fears. He was a man who carried them like stones in his chest. The next few days passed in uneasy quiet. Every crack of ice, every cry of a distant crow made her heart quicken one evening as the sun sank red behind the ridges. A shout echoed through the clearing. Wade had come, and he was not alone. Elias stepped outside, his rifle in hand, his face carved in stone. Wade stood at the edge of the clearing, his grin cold and cruel. He accused Elias of stealing what had been his, of hiding from justice, of living a life he did not deserve. Clara watched from the doorway, her pulse thundering in her ears. Elias spoke calmly, his voice even, but filled with sorrow. He did not try to defend himself. He only said that he wanted no more bloodshed, but Wade was beyond reason. His gun flashed and the world erupted in sound. Clara cried out, but Elias moved with the precision of a man who had lived through too many battles. The fight was brief and brutal. The echo of gunfire carried through the trees. Then silence. When it was over, Wade lay wounded but alive. Elias stood over him, his face pale, his breath ragged. Clara rushed to his side, clutching his arm. She begged him not to finish it, not to lose himself again. Her voice shook, but her eyes held steady. Elias lowered the gun, the weight of choice heavy in his hand. He told Wade to leave and never return, that the mountain was no longer a place for vengeance. As Wade stumbled away into the dark, the storm clouds broke overhead and snow began to fall thick and silent. Inside the cabin, Clara tended to Elias's wounds, her hands gentle, her voice low. He tried to push her away, muttering that she should not have stayed, that it was too dangerous, but she refused to listen. She told him that running had never saved anyone, that home was not made of wood and stone, but of people willing to stand beside each other. He looked at her then truly, looked at her, and for the first time the walls inside him crumbled completely. Outside, the storm covered the trail, wiping away every sign of the fight. And when Elias reached for her hand, he realized that this woman who had once been a stranger had become his reason to stay alive. The mountain no longer felt cursed, it felt like a promise, and in the quiet glow of the fire he whispered words he had not spoken in years. Words that made Clara's eyes fill with tears. Stay, he said, and she answered, I already have. The snow melted slowly across the mountain as spring crept back into the valley. The river swelled with life, and the forest awoke in shades of green and gold. Clara stood outside the cabin, her hands buried in the soil of the small garden she had begun to plant. She could hear the steady rhythm of Elias's axe in the distance, each strike echoing through the trees, the sound no longer lonely, but alive. Each morning now began with laughter, soft and hesitant at first, and each night ended beside the fire, with stories shared between two souls who had forgotten how to dream and were learning again together. Elias moved differently these days. The weight he had carried for so long seemed lighter, the lines of grief on his face softened by the warmth that filled the cabin. When Clara smiled, he caught himself smiling too. Though he tried to hide it once, he might have called that weakness. Now he knew it was the only strength worth having. He had spent years believing he was meant to be alone, that the mountains were both his punishment and his refuge. But Clara had proven that love was not the same as loss, that sometimes the heart needed to be broken open for something new to grow. The townspeople below spoke of the change. In the mountain man, they said, smoke rose steady from his chimney. Now that laughter could sometimes be heard through the trees, they did not know what had brought the change, only that the man who once turned every bride away now came to town beside. A woman whose presence filled every room with light. Clara greeted everyone kindly, never proud but never shy. She carried herself with the calm assurance of someone who had found her place at last, and those who once whispered behind her back found themselves falling quiet in her presence. Life on the mountain was still hard. There were storms that tested their resolve, and nights when the wind howled so fiercely that it shook the cabin, but they faced it all side by side when the roof leaked. They patched it together when the crops failed. They shared what little they had with the nearby settlers. When sickness struck one winter, Elias carried Clara for miles through the snow to reach the doctor, his fear raw and unguarded. She recovered, and when she woke to find him watching her, tears froze in his beard, and he told her he would rather face every storm in the world than live a single day without her. Years passed. The cabin grew stronger, with every repair the garden wider with. Every season they built a porch and planted flowers that bloomed wild and bright at its edge. Elias carved a rocking chair for her from pine, and she painted the door a soft blue that stood out against the brown of the logs. Sometimes they would sit together at dusk, watching the sky burn with sunset, and she would rest her head on his shoulder saying nothing, just breathing in the quiet that no longer felt empty. The ghosts of Elias's past never vanished completely, but they no longer ruled him. They lingered like distant shadows fading with each new dawn. He had thought himself cursed to lose every woman who crossed his path, but Clara had stayed, and in staying she had changed the story. The mountain that once mirrored his loneliness now reflected their love, vast and wild and enduring. One evening, as the last snow of the year began to fall, Elias took Clara's hand and led her outside. The air was crisp, the stars sharp and endless. He looked at her with a tenderness that words could not hold, and said the mountain used to keep everyone away. Now it keeps me here. She smiled and whispered, maybe it just needed someone stubborn enough to stay. He laughed, the sound deep and full, and as the snow fell around them, they stood together, unafraid, knowing that whatever storms came next, they would face them, not as the mountain man and the mail order bride, but as two hearts that had found home in each other.